As part of my series of Nintendo Fanboy reviews, Sega Genesis games, I'm going to be reviewing Lightening Force, Quest for the Dark Star, which honestly I'm not in love with this title at all. I, like many of the fans of the series, generally refer to this as Thunder Force 4, which is its official title in Europe and Japan, and from here on out, this is how I'm going to refer to this game. This is the third in the Thunder Force series to release on the Sega Genesis. The second through this fourth entries did so. The first entry released on Japanese computers in the early 80s, the fifth on Sega Saturn and PS1, and finally the sixth and last entry on the PS2. Going back to this fourth entry, it was released in January 1993 by company Technosoft and published by Sega. It should be noted that Sega does own the rights to all the Technosoft titles, thus they own the series. This title specifically is under the genre of shmups or shoot-'em-ups. Previous titles dabbled in more free-roaming shooting sections, though this fourth entry ditches that completely. Now, I heard of this game from one of my favorite YouTube content creators, Retro Bird. I'll put a link in the description to the video of his where he mentions this game. He's also one that leaned more heavily into Nintendo games growing up first, so I can definitely appreciate his opinion on retro games from the Sega Genesis and as a whole. Beyond this, I haven't heard of this series before at all, save seeing the second entry on this series get added to the NSO's expansion pack of Genesis games. After playing Thunder Force 4 for a few hours, I'd say there are a few comparable games to this on Nintendo systems. I could say the R-Type and Gradius series, but when the player gets hit once and dies in Thunder Force, it doesn't bring them back to the beginning of the level like these two series. While the player loses all of their power-ups and the single weapon they had on, the latter like Contra, their next ship and player life immediately replaces the one that dies. The action keeps going and there's no progression lost. Because of this, I'd say gameplay-wise it reminds me of Life Force on the NES or Darius Twin on the SNES. To be fair though, Life Force plays almost exactly like a Gradius entry, up to and including weapon and power-up progression. Darius Twin also has a long yet linear progression for this as well. I'd argue that Thunder Force 4 is the better of these two entries due to having a metal-inspired soundtrack, easy to learn but tough to master weapons the player gains, and a speed control mechanic that other shmups often relegate to power-ups as well. Now, during my first few minutes of playing Thunder Force 4, I noted all of the abilities that the game gives the player immediately. This includes two types of weapons with three additional slots that look like they can be filled. The first weapon fires two lasers in front of the player, with the second one firing one laser in front and one behind. These are fired with the B button, with them being able to be switched by hitting the C button. The A button changes the speed of the ship in 25% increments. I spent the first couple of stages at 50% speed for fear that if I went above that, I'd risk overheating the ship and thus destroying it. I of course had no idea that this wasn't any sort of a threat at the time. The speed adjustment makes it handy to increase speed during boss battles to quickly maneuver from their weapons, to lowering the speed so that you can carefully avoid environmental hazards in later stages. But my original worries are still funny looking back. One thing I did notice was that there would often be a lot of frame rate slowdown as more and more enemy sprites, gunfire, and or large bosses would take up more real estate on the screen. This slowdown was actually quite helpful, as it allowed the frenetic gameplay to become a bit more manageable. Now, if Sega and M2 made this under 60 FPS or released a remake in that way... I mention M2 as I played the Sega Ages version that was released on the Nintendo Switch in 2018. They added a handful of new features, including something called a Kids Mode. Don't let that name fool you. If you like what I describe and what you see for this game, play this mode first. It allows new players to keep their weapons upon death, as well as take one additional hit even without a shield power-up. This is very helpful, and I honestly wish I did this mode for my first few playthroughs. While the game offers a sizable 10 save states, I wish they would have had a rewind feature, much like other collections often have. Maybe that'd make this game too easy. Either way, again, the game is quite difficult. It kind of reminded me of the bullet hell type shmups my oldest brother had showed me back in 2004 when I went with him to a large LAN party that some other people were playing. Memorizing attack patterns and enemy placement will surely lead to victory, though being able to react quickly enough during a first playthrough will greatly help. As you can see from my video here, it only took me so far, seeing as how much I'm dying. Its difficulty level is par for the course for this genre. While I like Darius Twin, it's on the easier side of the difficulty spectrum, and because of that, I've heard from others of this genre call that specific entry kind of boring. Suppose that's why Thunder Force 4 is so difficult. I couldn't envision it being boring by any stretch of the imagination. Once again, the darker color palette that's afforded to the Genesis quite complements this game really well. The background and a number of environments look great, especially the parallax scrolling as seen in the first stage. I also loved how in certain stages the player's ship can scroll up and down beyond what is normally seen on a single screen. This allows a number of different views, again complementing this first stage quite well. This movement of screens sometimes can result in missed power-ups, but there's plenty to go around, I've found. I love all of the sprite details on both the player's ship as well as the enemies. The bosses and mini-bosses to every level are quite unique looking, firing weaponry that most of the time is easy to spot and work to dodge. My only issue here with the bosses is that I often had a hard time figuring out whether or not I was hitting their weak points and thus allowing further progression into the battles. Overall, this is probably one of the best looking Genesis games that I've played. The soundtrack now to Thunder Force 4 is probably one of the best on the Genesis. I can describe it as a mix between a synthy pop intertwined with a guitar-like metal sound. Composed by Naosuke Arai, he and his team were inspired by heavy metal music when making the soundtrack. It shows in a number of the boss themes as well as Stage 8's theme. This one's probably my favorite. They really pushed what the sound itself from the Genesis could do, and I could recommend this game just for this soundtrack alone. The sound effects were also created by Arai and his team. They've done a good job of capturing the solid feeling of the lasers shooting out of the player's ship, as well as when the ship itself gets destroyed. Now, I do feel the player's weapon hitting enemies could have had a more solid or even meatier sound to indicate it's being hit, but what they have is sufficient at least. I'm giving Thunder Force 4 9 out of 10 SNES controllers. I'll always have a special place in my nostalgia-addled heart for games like Light Force, Darius Twin, and Super R-Type. But it's really hard to deny that Thunder Force 4 is probably the best out of all of these. With fast, frenetic gameplay and a killer soundtrack to match it, can't recommend playing this game enough. Be prepared to die a lot though. As I mentioned before, it is available to play digitally on the Nintendo Switch via the Sega Ages series. With how difficult it is, don't feel bad for selecting the kids mode when firing the game up for the first couple play sessions. There are also a number of cheat codes available and other options to take the sting out of the difficulty as well. This game was also added to the Sega Genesis Mini 2 that just released and is available for sale on Amazon, distributed via Amazon Japan while supplies last. Now, what do you think about Thunder Force 4? If you've played shmup-style games before, where does this rank for you in this genre? Let me know in the comments section below, and also let me know if you're interested in playing this. Please like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more content. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.